So the last couple episodes of Legion, we've seen future Sid communicating with David, saying you have to help the Shadow King. You can't kill the Shadow King because if you do, on my timeline, everybody dies. Now she says my timeline, your timeline, seems to imply that there's multiple timelines going on. I wanted to clear up the three different interpretations of how time travel can work, what the interpretation the X-Men movies takes, and then what that means for how time travel is likely to work on this show. So in fiction, when time travel is possible and someone travels back in time and then does things, there's three possible ways that this can play out. One is that the future isn't changed at all, and you realize that everything that occurs has already occurred. All things occur simultaneously. So when you go back in time and think you're going to do something to change the future, really the future's unchanged. And sometimes you realize that you going back in time and doing something that was the very thing that caused the future you were trying to prevent in the first place. Now, this is probably the most realistic, with time travel, what is realistic? It's all theoretical, but this is probably the most complex, mature time travel. So you see Time Traveler's Wife, The Terminator is the classic example, the new show Dark that just came out. Those are all examples, and 12 Monkeys as well. Those are all examples of this kind of time travel. Now, second option is you go back in time, you change something, and then you go back to the future, and everything's changed on this one timeline. So this takes the view that, no, it's not true that everything exists at the same time, and everything that's going to happen has already happened. No, this takes the view that there's a timeline and things happen and then the timeline slowly grows out and out and out and out. Sorry, that was horrible hand motions. There's a timeline. I don't know how to do it with hands. There's one timeline. You go back on that single timeline and change something, and then the whole timeline is just changed. Now you could say that the whole timeline's destroyed and then a new timeline gets put in its place, or you can say that it's the same timeline and things are just slightly changed. But either way, there's only one timeline that ever exists. Third option is you go back in time, change something, and then you create an entirely new timeline that exists along with the old timeline. So your old timeline and your old self and the old future that you traveled back in time from, that still exists and that still goes on and new things happen in that timeline. But also when you go back in time and change something, you create a new timeline that branches off from a branch point from that old timeline. Now there's these two timelines running concurrently. So in the X-Men movies, which of these three versions of time travel do we have? We have the second. So where people get confused is oftentimes when people are trying to explain the continuity, they talk about two different timelines, and what's worse is they show these two different timelines side by side running concurrently, and it gives you the idea that there was a branch point and now we have two different timelines that are both running and continuing, when this isn't true. We only ever have one timeline, and we have the events of X-Men 1, X-Men 2, X-Men 3, the two Wolverine movies, and then we have Logan going back in time. Things change, and then this same single timeline, the only one we're ever talking about, things change on this timeline, and all the events that we saw in X-Men 1, X-Men 2, X-Men 3, those events are all gone. And that timeline is gone. It doesn't continue. That timeline ended in Days of Future Past. There's no continuing timeline. There's no new events in that timeline. All those events were just changed, wiped out, and now we're left with a new timeline, but it's the same timeline that we always had. It's just changed. Now, if you look at how time travel is going to work in Legion, you might say it doesn't matter how time travel works in the X-Men movies because it's not necessarily in the same universe, in the same timeline. I think it's true that it's not necessarily in either of these two timelines that we see in the movies. However, I think that just as you shouldn't have one superpower being possible in one of these timelines from the movies, and then that same superpower not being possible in a TV show timeline. I think that the fundamental nature of reality, the fundamental limits of what's possible, should be the same in both. So even if Legion doesn't take place in the movie timelines, I still think that time travel at a fundamental level should work the same across the board. So what does this mean for David trying to change this apocalyptic future he gets a glimpse of from future Sid? Now, if we were going with the first interpretation, where it's not possible to change the future, everything that's going to happen has already happened, what we'd see is David, he's trying not to kill the Shadow King in the desert. He says, look, I can't kill the Shadow King, can't kill the Shadow King. He would say, hey, Shadow King, come with me so I know you'll be safe, and let's go to the desert and hide out so we know no one's gonna kill you. And then he trips over a rock, he smashes the Shadow King accidentally, kills him, and says, oh no, me trying to not kill the Shadow King from that vision I got from the future, that was the very thing that made me kill the Shadow King, and we get the apocalyptic future because the future can't be changed. So we're not going to have that. The third interpretation we could have is David doesn't kill the Shadow King, and therefore there is no apocalyptic future in his timeline, so he continues in his timeline. Him and Sid may have this wonderful life together, but future Sid, in the timeline that was talking back to him, she still exists, and she's still in the apocalypse with everyone dead, and she just is kind of miserable. But I guess she can take pleasure in the fact that there's another timeline where her and David are happy together. So both these timelines, one with apocalypse averted, one with the apocalypse that still happened, both these will exist. New events will happen in both of them, and that would be the third interpretation. Now that's not true either. What's actually going to happen is if David doesn't kill the Shadow King, and therefore the apocalypse is averted, David, that future Sid who came in and talked to him, she won't really be wiped out. What happens is she'll wake up, she'll open her eyes, and suddenly there'll be a new future around her. And it'll, again, it sounds silly, but she'll open her eyes, and suddenly the future around her will be changed. And understand, this is in some sense the most happy option, because we do see future Sid, and we can kind of identify with her and relate to her. And the second interpretation of time travel, that's the only one where that future Sid would have a chance to be happy and not have to live the rest of her life in this apocalypse with everyone dead. Now, you might say, does future Sid, does she know? She's not going to know which interpretation of time travel, which is true for the reality she's in. So when she realizes she's able to go and communicate with someone from the past and try to get them to change the future, she doesn't know whether she's going to be inadvertently causing the very future that she's trying to prevent, or she doesn't know if when that future is changed and they succeed in their mission, she doesn't know if it's going to be her timeline that gets changed because there's only one timeline, or she doesn't know if she lives in a universe where there's going to be a branching off timeline where, yeah, the apocalypse is averted in this new timeline that's created, but she's still stuck with no reward for creating this timeline with an apocalypse averted. She doesn't get any kind of reward, and maybe she would like that just as much. She would say, look, I don't care about me, just as long as there's some timeline that still goes on where people are still happy and loving each other. That's fine, and I'm fine to live the rest of my life post-apocalypse, but I need the world to go on in some timeline. I need the world to continue. It's not about me, any kind of selfish desire for me to live in a world with no apocalypse. I just need some timeline to go on, and then I'll live on vicariously through that timeline. And last thing I'll say, how we know that it's time travel happening rather than there's a bunch of different alternate realities, and future Sid isn't really future Sid on the same timeline. She's just able to communicate with David from another timeline, and there's all these different timelines that exist concurrently, and rather than any kind of time travel going on, it's really just hopping from one timeline to another. How we know that this isn't true is because Carrie, we see him looking at the orb that captured David, and we see him getting the sense of deja vu, like he's worked on the orb before. Now what this implies is there's one timeline that Carrie is in, and in this timeline, Carrie grows up, then he realizes there's the apocalypse, we need to communicate with David, so he builds this orb. Future version of Carrie builds this orb, and that's why he's getting this sense of deja vu. Now this wouldn't happen if there's all these different timelines and they're communicating across from one timeline to the other. This only really makes sense if there's a single timeline and we do have some kind of sense of time travel.